Thank you. Can I invite you all just to take some deep breaths? And so you can soak in these words from the interfaith prayer. We pause in quiet reflection to offer this prayer for a peaceful world. In our individual and personal ways, we call upon the Holy One who sustains our lives and who inspire us to live with compassion and kindness and peace. We ask for daily guidance in all our personal relationships, in our work and play, and in our community involvement, that we might model the possibility of peace in everything we say and everything we do. We pray for wisdom and compassion within the hearts and minds of all world leaders who have the power and responsibility of making decisions that impact the presence of peace. We pray for courage, dedication, and integrity within the spirits of all those who work for peace around the world. We pray for all those who harbour thoughts and feelings of hatred, violence, and greed, that their hearts and minds and souls will be transformed into your likeness of compassion and kindness. We are thankful for your presence within our lives and ask for your blessing as we try to live peaceful lives and seek ways for all people to live in peace and justice. Give thanks and praise, I say. Over to you, Warren.
Thank you, Malika. In the very first workshop of this series, one of the things that came out from our groups was the idea of courageous conversations. And we are very pleased that we're able to explore that further tonight. And I think Sue is going to introduce our two key people, our two key speakers tonight to help us explore this. So Sue, all yours, thank you.
Hi, good evening, everyone. I'm really pleased to be able to welcome Janet and Diane tonight to give us a courageous conversation and help us understand how courageous conversations work. Diane and Janet were colleagues together at the Youth and Community Work team as part of the Youth and Community Work team at Manchester Metropolitan University. And recognising the value of Black lives, they made sure it was put firmly on the agenda for the team after the uprisings in Moss Side and other parts of the country in 1981. After which, as a result of the work of local activists such as Kath Lark, Black Access courses developed. More recently, they have taught together on a course called All Equal, All Different. And it was in that the context began with the invitation to have courageous conversations about race. Conversations that are always risky, but open to the possibility that both what is said and what is unsaid can change. So I really would like to welcome them both and hand over to them, and I look forward to what the groups after will discuss too. So thank you, Diane and Janet.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. So in talking about courageous conversation, which was always the invitation at the beginning of every session that we ran, we're not talking about a one-off thing, and we're not talking about something that happens just in words. It also develops into shared action, and it's a tumultuous thing. And everybody here knows that already, I think, because this network is already taking part in courageous conversation. But before we go on and talk more about our practice and share some of that, we'd each like to say something about ourselves. And I'd like to say something, first of all, about my own inheritance tracks. I was brought up mostly by my grandparents, who were from the Sheffield working class district of Attercliffe. And this gave me many advantages in this conversation, compared perhaps to my more middle class friends, who were definitely taught and brought up to be something called colourblind. They would say things like they don't notice colour. And my upbringing was not that. My grandparents definitely did notice colour. They weren't white nationalists. They were simply aware that there was a hierarchy, a colour hierarchy within the system. And even though we were pretty low in that system, there were always people, the people they referred to as the darkies, who were lower. They probably thought, and I think perhaps I thought as a child, that this was natural and unfortunate, but it was something like the weather. It was inevitable. And at the same time, they knew that these were people who'd suffered greatly, I think. They knew that. And they also knew that in terms of working class values, a culture that valued music highly, valued sport highly, then this was a place where Black achievement certainly rivaled that of white people. They loved the voices of Paul Robeson, Louis Armstrong, later Aretha Franklin, and the Four Tops. And I think they recognised that that music, at some level they recognised that that music comes out of a response to suffering. My granddad adored Cassius Clay, later Muhammad Ali, and so singing and boxing, one place where the apparently natural hierarchy of race was unsettled. And if you let the values of that working class culture through, maybe that racial hierarchy was being unsettled too. I was a clever little girl, and I understood that I was part of the class system from very young, but I did aspire to become part of the middle class by going to a top university. So maybe it was inevitable that I became a member of the Church of England. And when I did that, I think I started to learn some of the bad habits of that middle class culture, a white middle class culture, we could say, where the last thing you should ever do is talk about something that matters. I learned that one of the rules was don't talk about politics, don't talk about religion, and don't talk about sex or bodies at all. So obviously, being colourblind would have been part of that culture that I was growing into, joining, as I did as a teenager, the Church of England. However, that didn't stop me, and I somehow had enough resources, aged about 13, to stand up to my Latin teacher when Enoch Powell was making his poisonous speeches. And I think of that as my first courageous conversation. People always talk about Powell as a classicist, and they mention that he was a high Anglican, as if that somehow made him superior. But somehow that little 13-year-old girl knew from somewhere that my Latin teacher was wrong. So I had what you might call, like everybody, a mixed inheritance. So now I'm going to talk about what I'd like to pass on, because I was very fortunate to become a postgraduate student with the late and great Stuart Hall. I have to acknowledge that before I met Stuart at my interview for a postgraduate place at the Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies, I did not know that he was Black. In fact, he was only just starting to call himself Black, and that's another story. I've never seen a photo of him or heard his voice, just read his work. And I remember noticing my surprise at that fact, and then laughing at myself for my foolishness in a split second at the start of the interview. Here, the racial hierarchy was not just flipped, and easy to flip back again, therefore. Here, it was properly unsettled. Never again was it surprising to me to recognise and love spending time with, in person and through my reading, Black intellectuals, including, in time, theologians. Stuart had such presence, such intellectual range, and such a commitment to collaboration, which unearthed and made visible some of the powerful forms which later came to be called institutional racism. He unsettles those racial hierarchies in his own person and immediately. And the book he was in the middle of writing when I was so fortunate as to be taught by him was Policing the Crisis. He wasn't writing that on his own. Typically, he always worked collaboratively in collectives. And it was the very first sustained analysis of authoritarian populism, which shows the way race is mobilized to enable authoritarians to achieve and to sustain power. So those are the things that I want to pass on. And Diane is going to continue now.
Okay. Okay. Hello, my name is Diane Watt, and I'm a member of I'm one of the trustees of the Louise Dakakoji Education Trust. And in her presentation, Janet made reference to Kath Locke, and she also made reference to the 1981 disturbance. And Louise Dakakoji, alongside Eloise Edwards and Kath Locke, were very actively involved in supporting their community during this period. So thank you for highlighting Kath in your presentation, Janet. In terms of my own presentation, I'll begin by talking a little bit about my name. My name is Diane Watt. Okay, in terms of my first name, my birth name is in fact Diana. However, when I first came to this country, I didn't know as a minor from Jamaica to join my parents who arrived here as part of the Windrush movement. I wasn't aware that Diana and Diane were two separate names. Furthermore, being brought up in rural Jamaica, I was constantly teased for what they described as my ugly name, Dinah. So in order to avoid being teased, I then used my middle name, Beverly. However, when I arrived in this country and I was called Diane, I thought that's a better version than Dinah, so I willingly accepted it. Up until around 10 years ago, I was Diane Watt. And then we were asked, those of us who were not born in this country, were asked to submit our passports to HR. And that's when they discovered that my name is Diana, my birth name is Diana. And so they immediately changed my email address. So I now respond to either Diane or Diana. They both are quite relevant. Now, when it moves on to my name, Watt. Now, Watt is, my ancestors are enslaved African people. So Watt is not a name that it's a name, one of the names that they were given. And what I discovered whilst I was on the Youth and Community Work course, and we made a visit to the museum in Liverpool, was Robert Watt the First. Now he was what you'd call today a taxi driver who became very rich through the ownership of plantations in Jamaica. Now, although Richard Watt the First complained about the brutality that enslaved people experienced on the plantation, it did not stop him from investing in various slave ships. And the last one was one which carried around 549 enslaved Africans to Jamaica. Now, when he retired, he then handed over his fortune to his nephew, Richard Watt III. Now, Richard Watt III, he invested in Speke Hall, which will be seen in my PowerPoint. Now, Speke Hall is part of the money earned through the purchase of plantations in Jamaica. Now, during the period of 1830, the period of the end of slavery, Robert Watt III was amongst the people who were compensated for the loss of their property, i.e. the loss of their property, i.e. enslaved African people. Now he received compensation equivalent to today, in today's day, it's around £600,000. I will now move on to the slides, Warren. Warren, could you? Yeah. Okay, so now when we talk about the very fact of talking about slavery and enslavement, especially for people such as myself, whom it's not just a story, it has been part of our reality. And it's not only just part of our reality, it's also part of British reality. It's also part of British history, a history which has been denied and which has been denied. But so in that sense, it's a conversation that has been silenced. So taking on board Audre Lorde's, in terms of courageous conversation, Audre Lorde talks about, and when we speak, we're afraid our words will not be heard nor welcomed. But when we're silent, we're still afraid. So it is better to speak. And this is kind of relevant to the course that Janet and I taught in the All Equal, All Different course, because it meant both Black and white students had to speak. And there are times when it was uncomfortable, but we created a space for those voices to be heard. Now, if we go to the second slide, this is, I may have some investment in this. Knows? Okay. So, I don't know how you pronounce it, it's Speke Hall or what, but this is Speke Hall. And so this is one of the, its maintenance, its purchase was all built on, was all through the profits earned from the enslavement of African people. And you cannot just say that this is Black history. This is British history. It's British history, it's also Black British history. And this is something that, but it's Black British history doesn't really address these particular areas. It's as though they don't exist. I'll move on to the next slide, sorry. Now, earlier when I talked about my name, I think it was based on the people such as Malcolm X, what's in a name? So he started off by being Malcolm Little, just like how I'm Diane Watt. And his rationale is that Little represents the name of maybe one of the people who owned his family. And so he then, so that means it is a meaningless name, it's an oppressive name. And so he then removed that name and referred to himself as Malcolm X, meaning that his surname is unknown. That he also, when he converted to Islam, he went on to be El Hajj Malik Shabazz, El-Hajj Malik Shabazz. Now, it's also, I particularly use this image because it's important to look at this one where it says, "That's not a chip in my shoulder, that's your foot in my neck." Now that was said in the, at least 30 years ago. And I included this slide of George Floyd, which has triggered off these presentations to show that what Malcolm X is saying is exactly what happened to George Floyd. Are you okay, Warren? Oh, okay. As you can see, it's a knee in his neck. And when he talks about, "Please, I can't breathe. My stomach hurts. My neck hurts. Everything hurts. They're going to kill me." And that's exactly what they did. So Malcolm's prediction was absolutely accurate. We then go on to another person who openly challenged another name, Clay. Again, Clay is a reflection of the last slave owner that owned his family. And so he then converted to Islam and changed his name to Muhammad Ali. And the change was a part of the protest against racism and the enslavement of our ancestors. And so if you, oh, it's the next one, okay. So when we talk about Black history and we say British history, because David Lammy, the Labour MP, says, "I'm here because you were there." And that applies to every one of us, because our presence in Britain, as you can see, did not start with the Windrush. It's just one phase. We're here because you were there. My ancestors were British subjects, but they were not British subjects because they came to Britain. They're British subjects because Britain came to them, took them across the Atlantic, colonized them, sold them into slavery, profited from their labor, and made them British subjects. That is why I'm here. So in terms of our people of the Windrush generation, this was kind of a very common sign when they arrived here during the 40s, 50s, and 60s. No Irish, no Blacks, no dogs. Oh, sorry, have I? And here, again, no Blacks, no dogs, no Blacks, no Irish, no Blacks, no dogs. And then if I move on to the next slide, please. And here, there are people protesting against the, Windrush generation, which talks about helping to build Britain. So each generation, whether they're enslaved or not, has been part of British history and has contributed tremendously to the development of Britain. But that is very much separated from history. The next one, please. Now, when we go into racism, I decided to use three definitions. Malcolm X described racism. He says, "Racism is like a Cadillac. They bring out a new model every year." And I think that's quite true. And you get, racism is not a question of attitude, it's a question of power. This was by Stokely Carmichael, who did not convert to Islam, but he also changed his name to Kwame Ture. And we have Audre Lorde, who says, "Racism, the belief in the inherent superiority of one race over all others, thereby the right to dominance." Yeah. And I then chose this example by Barack Obama to show you about the right to dominance. When he arrived in the White House, he said, "We became especially close to a regular crew of chefs and butlers all of whom we had daily contact, As with my valet, all of them were Black, Latino, or Asian American. And while they were uniformly glad to have well-paying, secure jobs with good benefits, it was hard to miss in the racial makeup of, it was hard to miss in the, sorry, I can't see that bit.
In the racial makeup.
Oh, no, I can't see it now. It was hard to miss in the racial makeup the vestiges of earlier time when social rank had clear demarcations, and those who occupied the office of president felt more comfortable in their privacy when served by those they assumed were their equals and therefore could not judge them. Were not their equals. Yeah. Who they assumed were not their equals. So again, going back to Obama, so, you know, white presidents were quite at home in the presence of Black, Latino, and Asian workers within the White House, because they're in that sense of superiority and privilege was theirs for the taking. Barack Obama went on to say, it would take us months of coaxing before the butlers were willing to change their tuxedos for khakis and polo shirts when serving us meals. And they said, we just want to make sure you're treated like every other president. In other words, like we treat you like how we treat white presidents. Von explained, that's right, Buddy said. See, you and the First Lady don't really know what this means to us, Mr. President. Having you here, he shook his head. You just don't know. Just move on to the. So, going on to Martin Luther King, who was played a significant role in the civil rights movements. I came across this quote. There's a church at the corner in Charlton, at the corner near Sandy Lane, and I saw this quote which says, "In the end, we remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends." And then this is a poem that this presentation by Martin Niemöller is one that we also use in the All Equal, All Different course, where it says, they came for the communist and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the socialist and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionist and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me and there was no one left to speak out for me. And I think that it applies to us all. And so, Janet, I'll hand over to Janet.
Thanks, Diane. So you can see that, you know, the students and for all of us digesting and taking in these powerful truths raises many feelings. And so as we embark on courageous conversation, and the feelings that are raised in us need to be understood. And those feelings are going to be different depending on how we're positioned in these racial hierarchies, depending who we identify with when we hear these accounts. And so we invited these brave conversations, but we always knew that these conversations weren't on their own. They were going to move on to another stage. And to get to that next stage, we had to acknowledge the anger that was generating, that was emerging as people encounter these truths. And we have written something about the anger in a piece that we've written called the Place of Anger in the Work of Love. And I think these words about the need to redress wrongs in relationship that may manifest in anger are things that are understood very deeply in many of the faith traditions that are present in this network. And those faith traditions are a great resource for us in confronting the anger. They're also a great resource in confronting the forms that silence can take. And silence has many reasons. and it takes many forms. There isn't just one explanation for why we choose to remain silent if we do. One of the major issues that we faced in the university, and I believe this to be the case in faith organisations and in all the big organisations and institutions of our society, was what you can call the brick wall. The denial of experience and the pretense that all is well is a major factor in establishing silence and sharing strategies for working against that brick wall became a really important part of our work. In the second part of the work, we always invited practitioners from different big institutions where there is institutional racism, from the police, from education, from health, from the arts and culture. And I'm sure we could also have invited people from the established church to share with us the strategies that have been developing over years, really, to continue these conversations, to continue to break the silence and to shift the patterns that we're talking about. But this May, just to finish on a personal note again, this May, it was the impact for me of hearing about the small personal forms of insult and differential treatment that I'd heard about all my working life from Black colleagues, and I'd never really seen them as part of the pattern of institutionalised racism. For example, colleagues being mistaken for the cleaning staff or for the canteen staff when they arrived at work to undertake their jobs as lecturers. For example, going out on placements and being asked if they were the taxi driver or if they'd come to arrange the cleaning of the building, not being recognised as teachers visiting students on placement in schools. I'd heard all these stories all my working life, and yet it took the shaking events of May and some of the speaking out through the media that I heard from professors and others to help me see that these were not random events for which I felt compassion. They were part of a systematic pattern in which it had become impossible for white people in white institutions to recognise their Black colleagues as their equals. And so to unsettle these things is the task now. And there are many, many ways to unsettle it, and the conversation is the beginning of that unsettling. Angela Davis continues to do that for me when she talks about the way language shapes our perception. And she says, this has stuck with me so much since I first heard her say it. Black women are talked about as a minority. Black women are talked about as a minority within a minority. But the truth is, Black women are not a minority. Black women are a majority. And as a matter of fact, says Angela Davis, Black women are a majority within a majority. Now, as soon as you recognise that that's the truth, words like BAME, which I find very hard to stomach because it mixes up so many different things and confuses this reality of who are the majority contributors and possessors of the world that we live in, then everything starts to shift. And enabling that shift, enabling the move away from white supremacy, white superiority, towards a more egalitarian way of relating to each other. That's the task that we're setting ourselves when we embark on courageous conversations. So you have to think about it, I believe, as something that happens systematically, and it happens over time, and it requires a lot of resetting and a lot of capacity to support one another and trust one another in the process. Just to finish with June Jordan, an African-American poet who's been incredibly inspirational to me. She said that when we get the monsters off our backs, the monsters of racism, we may all want to run in a very different direction. And so we can't let racism be the thing that, or challenging racism, be the thing that defines us or defines our unity. We have to find common ground in how we can support one another and what we can do for each other. She says, it's not only who we are, so it's not only what our names tell us about ourselves or our histories tell us about ourselves, it's also what we can do for one another, how we can use our power in any situation that will determine the connection. And generally speaking, in any hierarchy, in any institution, those of us who are positioned as white will have access to power and resources that we can mobilise in support of our brothers and sisters. So we'd like to invite you to continue this conversation now in the groups. And Diane, do you want to just read out the questions that we're going to ask the groups to think about?
Okay, okay. Okay. The first one of the questions is, what makes a courageous conversation? Can you think of ones you have used, you have had, and ones you want to have? Are there times you remain silent? Why? Where and with whom might you build alliances for change? So those are the three questions for discussion. Okay.